Good morning, everyone. We thank you all for joining us today as part of our inaugural Tigunia Virtual Forum. We greatly appreciate everyone who has joined us for this presentation, and we hope the information shared during this presentation is beneficial to you and your team after you leave here today. My name is Kelly Porter, one of the sales team members here at Tigunia, and I will be your moderator for this presentation. And it will be approximately 45 minutes with a 15-minute Q&A at the end. We do encourage that you ask questions, as this is ultimately about providing you with as much information as possible. All questions are to be asked in the Q&A chat, and we will review and answer each question at the end if they were not already answered during the presentation. Without further delay, I introduce to you now James Nicholas, our Vice President of Information Technology here at Tigunia. James?
Thank you for that introduction, Kelly. I am super excited to be here this morning. This is an exciting time for everybody here at Tigunia to be able to reach out to the community and partake in this event. Today is the first of several awesome sessions that are going to be happening for the Tigunia Virtual Forum. And I have the privilege to be able to start with a particular session topic that we have a lot of people ask about. We're going to talk through Business Central hosting options today. And as I work through that, I just want to say thank you for being here. Please ask questions. If you have any questions that come up that you want to take offline with us in a one-on-one, I would be happy to do that. So we're going to dig into this topic in a really fun way here today. We're going to be talking about a lot of things. Before I dig in, I want to make sure you know who I am. My name is James Nicholas, the VP of Information Technology. I do a lot here at Tigunia, specifically around platform, everything infrastructure, the stuff behind the scenes, the stuff that most people don't really care about until it stops working. But at the end of the day, what we do on the IT side of the business is all about making your organization more successful. I've been consulting with people around solving business problems with technology for over 15 years, and it's exciting to see how technology is changing and how Microsoft and Business Central is making a lot of those things happen. I've got some fun information up on the slide for you, little details about myself on the personal side, should anybody be interested. If anyone wants to connect, please feel free to reach out to me on my LinkedIn or via email. So without any further ado, we'll dive in. Business Central 16 hosting options. Many people that we work with get really confused as we start talking about Business Central and how you can host it and why you would host it and what you would do with it. So today, as we talk through this, my goal for everyone in this session is to equip you to ask the right questions. The idea here is to make sure that you're able to ask the questions that'll help your organization get where you need to go and understand why you would host in a one way versus another. So as we work through this, there's a simple statement that I want you to try and keep in mind when we talk about anything that you might consider a cloud option. So fun statement. A fun statement about it all is to be able to say we have 5 different options, and they get pretty confusing, right? We talk about cloud applications, we talk about where you're putting your data, and there's a ton of acronyms, alphabet soup, as one might say. So we're going to work through those acronyms. Your options as you talk through this and you consider it are going to be your cloud application, a SaaS application, software as a service. You can put Business Central on your own hardware. This could be in your environment. It could be in a server under your desk in the back room. It could be at a co-location if you decided you wanted to have it on hardware you own, but at a data center that you trust. You could also host it on a private cloud or a public cloud. Private cloud and public cloud are very similar conceptually, have subtle differences, and we'll talk through that and unpack that here today as well. So talking through each of these, before I can really dig in to which direction you would go and what they are, I want to make sure there's some clarity for everyone around the software as a service component, the wonderful industry acronyms that come with that. So a quick explanation for everybody. cloud computing has multiple models: infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. These three concepts are pervasive throughout the industry for many different things. In fact, most of you probably use some amount of these already in your organization. And if you don't think that you do, and you're stretching for an option to understand, like, okay, what's a SaaS product that you have currently? If nothing else, consider YouTube. That fun little tool that a lot of people like so they can watch their cat videos. At the end of the day, that's a software as a service. Now, you probably don't pay for it unless you subscribe to YouTube Red, but you don't care what servers it's on. You don't care where they're located. You don't care how you get to them. You just care that you can go to youtube.com and stream your cat videos or whatever other video you might want to watch. SaaS provides a promise to you that is very different from a platform as a service or an infrastructure as a service. What is being provided is the end deliverable. What's being provided for the other two are components that are behind the scenes, helping to offload what you have to be responsible for. So if you look at it in a little bit more detailed model, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, it's all about which components of that infrastructure are things you still have to deal with or are dealt with for you. So working through which pieces are going to be pieces you have to be responsible for, understanding how much responsibility you want to maintain, and with that responsibility, how much access and control you want to have. So as we walk forward, the licensing options for Business Central become an important part of what I'll call a decision tree. When you look through this and you understand, okay, I have different models here. I can have infrastructure as a service, or I can have software as a service, and figuring out where your Business Central might go. Long before you ask which one you want, you need to determine which licensing solution you want to go with. And this is because of implications that Microsoft has built into their licensing for this. So we'll start there. There's two licensing models. You can do subscription licensing and perpetual licensing. If you do subscription licensing, this is the equivalent of paying for it every month or leasing your license. If you do a perpetual license, you pay for it up front, you purchase it, and then you pay for maintenance on it. The example of what this is would be like on a subscription license, you were to go ahead and lease a car. And if you were to do a perpetual license, it's like buying a car and then having yearly maintenance on that car. So talking through this, the terms can become very similar and become confusing very quickly. I've heard many people interchange these terms as though they're synonyms because that's natural. It's the way marketing departments have led us to talk about these things for years, but Microsoft actually draws some distinctions on these things. So the first thing I want to call out is that a subscription is not the same as SaaS. If you're doing a subscription license, that's not the same as a software as a service, okay? They are not the same thing. On-premises is not the same as perpetual, right? So as we talk through this and we make this distinction, we say, okay, if on-premises is not the same as perpetual, they're not the same thing, how complicated can this get? Well, it can get pretty complicated. Microsoft does their best to make sure that behind the scenes, they try to make sure that we all know what's going on. Here you can see this is what Microsoft likes to do for us. And as we work through the minutia of how Microsoft licenses things, they love to throw extra stuff at us and really make it so we have a hard time landing on it. And oftentimes, I'm sure many of you might feel a little bit like this when you're working with Microsoft licensing. You try so hard to make sure that you get the right licensing in place, but try as you may, Microsoft doesn't make it easy. So I've mentioned that there's some differences, some distinctions that they make on things. An entertaining piece to this whole conversation that Microsoft has a tendency to themselves actually misrepresent in some of their published articles is about whether or not something is an on-premise license or an on-premises license. Fun use of terms when we talk about language. Many people find the premise of an on-premises license confusing. I would like to suggest the idea to everyone that a premise is an idea and a premises is a location. This is subtle. It's an English thing, but as we walk through it and we're talking about the on-premises license, what I want you to keep in mind is that on-premises is talking about the fact that it's a license you can take home with you. It's a license for your location. That's the crux of it. So for those of you that are English nerds out there, I went ahead and pulled together those definitions so you can see what I'm talking about. A premise is an idea, or otherwise it's going to be something that you might postulate. Okay, it's a premise or an argument. And premises is going to be a tract of land, of building, a location. So digging into this as we talk about an on-premises license and what that looks like, there are two approaches that we talked about earlier, two models, subscription and perpetual. On the left, you have the subscription licenses, and that can be delivered as a SaaS product. That means that you're purchasing the subscription license and you don't have to worry about anything behind the scenes. It is delivered to you just like YouTube, SaaS product, okay? You can also do an on-premises license with a subscription. And this is a piece that confuses people sometimes. So if you do a subscription with an on-premises license, there are some requirements that build into that. The licensing requirements from Microsoft require that subscription on-premises license would be hosted and maintained and in control of your partner, whether that's hosted on a SaaS product or an infrastructure as a service product. That could be hosted with the partner on their own infrastructure. It could be hosted in Azure. It could be hosted in many places, but those are options that exist to you. If you go down the direction of perpetual licensing, the partner can host it with an on-premises license for you. You can host it in your own office on your hardware. You can host it in your colo. You can also use that on-premises license self-hosted inside of Azure or some other public cloud. So there are a lot of options, but it's critical to understand as you dig into where you're going to put your data to understand how you're going to license the product and what that then provides for options to you. Okay. So again, just for clarity, what I did is I put together a quick chart here so you can understand perpetual versus subscription, self-managed versus partner managed, what those licenses are and what that looks like. As you talk through this, please, you're going to want to take this internally. Talk to your team members, understand how do you want to pay for the product, and then understand what requirements does your organization have around where and how you host that product. Self-managed hosted deployments as an infrastructure as a service do require an active enhancement plan. And that's something that I want to make sure I call out so that you're aware of it. All right, hopefully you guys aren't getting too lost here. Sometimes as I dig into some of the licensing, I feel exactly like this, that we have this type of a situation with Microsoft. So we're going to select the hosting options, go through the considerations. We're going to talk about it. So you've decided whether or not you want to go with a subscription or a perpetual license. You decide which one you want, and you have to try and figure out where are you hosting it, how are you hosting it. There's a simple statement around that I really want you to be able to drive home and take on. Whenever you're looking at any kind of cloud product, it's important to understand that the idea behind cloud is that you don't have to worry about it. The reality of the cloud, it's not your circus, not your monkeys, not my circus, not my monkeys. Wonderful, wonderful Polish proverb. And that's really the reality here. As you look at any kind of a cloud product, you're deciding at what point do you no longer want to worry about that component? What are you putting off of your plate and onto theirs. This is the same as the very first cloud product that was publicly accepted, and that's that of your utilities. Many of you have power in your building, and you don't care how it gets there or where it comes from. You don't care if that's hydropower or if it's wind power or if it's coal or where it's coming from. Maybe you do care about it, but at the end of the day, the important piece is you have power in the building. As you look at some of these components, the idea is, where do you draw the line on which pieces are going to be components that you're going to care about? So let's talk about the one component that's like, it's the elephant. It's the first starting point, and that's SaaS. So you're doing a subscription model and you want to do software as a service through Microsoft. As you look at that option, there's a lot of things to consider. What do you gain? And in addition to what do you gain, what do you lose? What's the give and take on a SaaS approach? So software as a service, reminder for everyone, implies that you do not have control of anything behind the scenes. You just have access to the end deliverable, your ability to log in and use the product. So let's talk through that. The first thing that many organizations have to concern themselves with around whether or not they want that approach is all about the data control for that environment. How much control do you have, and are you okay with giving that up? Two sides to the same coin here. Giving up the control means you're giving up the responsibility as well. You don't have to touch it or maintain it, but you also can't touch it or maintain it. Control of the disaster recovery schema, control of what performance you have running in there, controlling the actual data. This is something that sometimes people laugh at, but I've talked to a number of business owners where they don't feel comfortable if they don't feel like they can touch and feel their data. As funny as that might be, because it's always been a digital thing, right? A hard drive on your desk, you still can't touch the data, it's in a hard drive. But it's important, both emotionally, but also for some organizations, from a compliance and regulatory perspective, they have to be able to be in control of the data at all times. Updating on your timing, when you want to upgrade, being able to go in and say, I want to make sure that this update is happening at this time. If you come from the nav world, where you may have done updates on a very slow cadence or maybe very infrequent, maybe not at all, these are timing controls that you have when you are in control of it. As it relates to Business Central in a SaaS environment, that upgrade's happening. Now, this could be very good for your organization. It could also be taxing. There is a concept called waves as we talk through environmental and data control, and when that update is occurring, those waves are going to happen currently twice per year. So this is all important components. The wave release opt-out is included on this slide deck. Quick link to it so you can read about that should you choose to dig deeper on that, or if that becomes an important piece for you. You can ask for these slide decks at the end of the session if that's helpful for you. The next component is the actual resource allocation. When we talk about what you're getting for resources and how that's going to perform. If you're doing something in the environment that isn't what Microsoft explicitly expected, and you want some semblance of more memory, more CPU, different disk, whatever it might be, you are limited as to what you can do there. Let's talk about support. You can, at any given time, on all versions, get support from your partner. But how much support they can lend you, what they have access to do for you, is subtly different between the different options. And if you go with SaaS, you can go to your partner for support, but they can only go so far. And after that, you have to get something back from Microsoft, and that can be pretty painful sometimes. We don't want to be too mean to Microsoft, right? They do have a pretty awesome product, but at the end of the day, one of the benefits of having the partner network is the support that those partners can provide you. If you have to do some debugging in your live environment, that's not possible in the SaaS version. So should there be an issue that requires that level of debug, it is not an option. If you need direct access to your SQL server for any kind of data migration, initial go live, or advanced reporting functionality, that is something that you do not have access to in the SaaS product. So these are some restrictions on how you get the support and what you can do during those instances when you need support or direct access to that data set. From an ISV perspective, many ISVs are pushing their products forward to be compatible with Business Central 16. It's actually quite exciting to see what's happening in that space, but not all of them are. Not all of them are there yet, and some ISVs require direct integrations to touch your SQL Server. They have other add-ons or integrations that are not currently compatible with Business Central 16. You might have other legacy connectivities. If you have EDI in your environment, there are a ton of EDI vendors that are either not yet ready for BC16, or once you start getting heavy into transaction loads, you can run into performance problems. EDI is one of the most intensive components to a Business Central environment in many cases because of the rights and how it operates. And that, when you reference it out against the storage that you get from Microsoft, sometimes isn't going to perform as well as you need it to, or it's going to impact the performance of other components of the environment. So that's ISV considerations. From a SQL perspective, most of you here should be familiar with Microsoft SQL, MS SQL. SQL Server performance is really important for any application that's going to be running off of SQL Server. As you scale up your Business Central SaaS deployment, you don't have direct control currently for the SQL Server configuration behind the scenes. It's going to be running on Microsoft's Azure SQL product, which is by itself a pretty fantastic product. It's very useful, it can do a lot of things. The way that product scales is by instance size. As you scale up your CPU and your memory, we call that the compute. As you scale that up on the elastic pool or on the instance, you can then have the I/O, the disk input output, scale with it. So all of that to say, in a Business Central environment, you don't have the ability to scale that yourself. And so you get the performance that's given, and that's it. SaaS can work really well for some organizations if those components are not a requirement. But if they are, I'd encourage some testing. As you walk further through things within SQL and what you can do there, your reporting and your capabilities of how you can handle your reporting also become an important decision point. So if you're looking at going Business Central SaaS as your hosting option, consider how you're going to report off of it and whether or not it meets your business needs. Talk to a consultant that can help you, and maybe you can accomplish it, but you might have to have a slightly more difficult setup by doing something like an SSRS option inside of it. So let's talk through the other big piece, and that's control of that data, your restorability. Let's talk SaaS backup and disaster recovery. You need disaster recovery in your environment. You need to be able to recover your data. And when you're going SaaS, your controls around that are built in. The controls around how you handle SaaS are going to be set for you in advance, and you can't change it, but you can work with it. This is going to work for a lot of organizations, but not all. So right out of the gate, your backups are automatically controlled by Microsoft. If you have specific requirements on your BCDR, you can't change it yourself. You have to trust that that's being handled for you. This is the opposite side of that two-sided coin I talked about a moment ago. You don't have the ability to control it, but you also don't have to touch it or worry about it. It is handled for you. It's managed by Microsoft on a SaaS product. Your SaaS instances have a predetermined backup schedule. Now, for anyone in this session that, as I start talking about backup and disaster recovery, if you have questions or don't quite understand all of the objectives I'm talking about here, I have sessions later this week in this track where I walk through that. I walk through business continuity, protecting your organization, and I walk through security and the related components. So if anything I don't cover here is something that leaves a question in your mind, please join me in those sessions and we'll dig deeper into those concepts. Suffice it to say, you do get a fairly robust backup. It goes all the way down to transaction log backups every 5 to 10 minutes. It's not a guaranteed every 5 minutes, it's 5 to 10 because of load on the environment, can sometimes take longer. So this means that theoretically, your restorability in SaaS is down to the 10-minute increment on data. We call that your restore point objective. How quickly you can restore it, how far back it goes, and whether or not that has a lasting impact on your business. This is all stuff that we think is important for every organization to plan around, to talk about internally. How do you want to set those values? Your SaaS retention for your database are only kept up for 30 days. 30 days can be fine for some organizations, but could be crippling for others. If you do a month-end close process and you need to go back to day 31 because your month-end close identified that there was an issue and you have to reference prior to the previous month-end close 30 days ago, you don't have that 31st day. The same can be said if you need to go back and reference what things were looking like 1 year ago. An average retention objective that a lot of my customers look for is a 13-month objective on retention. So you can go back to the month prior to the last year's close. So you can close a year, but still reference the prior year should there have been something that was missed. Hopefully that's never the case, but knock on wood, sometimes you need to do that. Your backup and restores require a ticket with support. The RTO, how long it takes to get restored in the event of a disaster, is not currently explicitly called out for Microsoft. It had been in the past set to a 4-hour RTO, but it's no longer published within their documentation. So it's not a guaranteed restore time. When we're talking about this restore time, I'm talking about being able to restore your data, not necessarily the active service. Microsoft tries to do their best to keep the service active, but if that service is down and they get the service back up, and for whatever reason, maybe you were running something against the database and you now have to restore from backup, how long it takes for that can be slightly painful. This is the important piece some people don't know, is you cannot actually request a backup copy of your production database. It is stated in Microsoft documentation, and I have that actually linked here also in the slide for anybody that wants to read it. You are not able to go, hey, Microsoft, give me a copy of this data set. Now, there are ways to get the data out. It's just not nearly as convenient as one might imagine. So as I talked through the SaaS product, I highlighted a lot of components that can be considerations against SaaS. Before I move off of the SaaS discussion option, I want to make sure that I'm very clear. SaaS can be a wonderful solution for a lot of organizations. It removes a lot of the overhead that you have administratively. It removes a lot of the considerations you have to have on the infrastructure behind the scenes. It takes care of a lot of those pieces and at a very inexpensive price point. But with that, you lose certain things. And if those things that you lose are not business or organizationally impactful for you, then it's a great solution. But if they are, then you should consider some of the other solutions that Microsoft makes available to you. So let's talk about what it looks like to do on-premises options. Again, a reminder to everybody here, as we move into on-premises options away from SaaS options, this is on-premises as far as how you're hosting it. It can be licensed on-premises for both a subscription as well as a perpetual license. So keep that in mind. And now there's certain components here that can go in either direction. At the beginning of this discussion, I pulled up a slide stating all the different hosting options. Cloud applications, software as a service was the first thing that we talked about. So we've discussed that one. The next, you have your own hardware, colo, hosted infrastructure in a public or private cloud. All of these require an on-premises license. So let's dig into some meat. Your own hardware, on-premises infrastructure, some reasons you would want to go in this direction. If you feel like you want to be able to touch and feel all of your digital assets, you want to have that emotional connection to it. If you already have a data center infrastructure in your building, many organizations years or decades ago invested into the infrastructure in their building to accommodate this. Many organizations did not. But if it's already there and you've already invested it, the concepts of sunk costs could make you want to move away from it. Or you may look at it and say, the infrastructure is there, still stable, still well invested, and for potentially other business reasons, you want to keep going with that. And that's okay too. A note here, if you remember that chart I put up earlier, on-premises infrastructure, if you do that, you have to do subscription licensing. Disaster recovery can be an important component to this. A lot of organizations choose to take their disaster recovery objectives towards an area of business continuity where they have full understanding, documentation, and process planning for their people and their technology. And when you go into that process, it is easy to say, let's take all of our technology and protect it under a single protection paradigm. And that's okay. That's sometimes the necessary area. And sometimes you want to do on-premises just because you can't let it go. And that's also okay. On-premises infrastructure can have some big advantages, especially at very, very large scale. Most organizations, if you consider yourself SMB, if you consider yourself small to medium sized, you likely should not be doing an on-premises infrastructure that's hosted in your office. Very likely in that size, you should be hosting it either at a colo or completely removing your need to manage that infrastructure. There are custom scenarios where an in-office deployment might make a lot of sense. An example from a client that I worked with recently, they have a need because they do a lot of transportation to have a manual control that's direct serial connection into some fuel pumps on their property. That requirement with the serial connection and that old school baud rating control meant that they needed to have a physical piece of hardware that was able to somehow connect to and communicate with their ERP. That requirement is a unique business requirement that made it so that they needed an on-premises solution. And at the time, there was not an appropriate secure option for us translating that serial connection into an internet-based solution or IP-based solution. So consider options. You might have something unique to your organization that might take you down this particular road. Let's say you go from the idea of an on-premises solution to maybe doing a co-location, colo for short. A colo is designed to take all of the building and utility components of hosting your own hardware solution out of the equation. So it takes the internet, the power, the heating and cooling, those three utility components, as well as the physical rack space, just like renting space in the mall, that physical space to house it, all of those components get removed when you do a colo. Okay. You still have, when you do a colo, control over the hardware. It is still your hardware and you're still responsible for it. So unless the air conditioning breaks or the power goes out or the internet stops, and the internet stopping is not because of your own firewall, switch, or router, then you no longer have those particular issues. You get a lot of flexibility, pretty much the same flexibility as you would have had with it being in your office. And if any of these things fit your need, your organization, then that's great. and this is something that you should move forward with. So the last two things we just talked through are both still your hardware and different levels of control that you have. If we move this one step further and we talk about your data and moving it to the cloud, let me just tell you, this is not where your data is stored. The cloud is a fascinating thing. It's a marketing concept, but at the end of the day, there is tangible hardware behind the scenes that make this happen. What if I told you serverless runs on servers? No matter what you do, there's somebody's server somewhere hosting this out, making it happen. So the first example is going to be that public cloud example, something that a lot of you've probably looked into, talked about, heard people talk about. You can do whole conversations and presentations around just hosting in Azure or AWS or Google Compute. The quick list on why you might want to go in that direction is to either lower costs on hardware infrastructure. Now, this is one I'll stay on and I'll talk to you guys for a second about. When you go to look at the cost comparison, if you are used to buying some, gaming laptop to run your business, or a single server that sits in a closet that has mid-range specs, that's not the comparison that most people use when they talk about the cost comparison for public cloud versus an on-premises solution. Most comparisons are assuming that you need some level of availability, redundancy, and protection that require extra licensing, duplication of hardware, and redundancy in the infrastructure. It is only when you take all of those costs into consideration that a public cloud solution actually can be a lower cost solution. No maintenance is another one. This is a consideration most people have when they come into it. They think, all right, well, I don't have to maintain things anymore. Well, depending on what level of infrastructure you decided to do, whether that's an infrastructure as a service or a software as a service or a platform as a service. So we talked about software as a service, and now we're talking about if you're in control of it. So this implies infrastructure or platform as a service. Infrastructure as a service means you don't have to worry about the hardware, the virtualization, any of the stuff behind the scenes, the switches, any of that. But you do still have to worry about the actual servers you're logging into, those operating systems, the configurations on them, the things that are configured within the operating system. And so when we talk no maintenance, that's talking about all the infrastructure maintenance on your switches and the physical hardware. But you still have maintenance in other areas. There's a near unlimited scalability. I think most organizations, most business owners can appreciate the idea that you want to be able to scale your organization at and when the need arises, but how far do you need to scale it? There's design decisions that you have to make as you're building out your environment. And if you're designing for scale, putting the environment on a very scalable infrastructure, such as a public cloud, can make it a lot easier. You don't have to buy into certain scale points because those scale points are already set by the provider. So near unlimited scalability. Integration into your other features can become an important point. So there's an option with Business Central 16 that I want to highlight here for everybody that maybe hasn't considered it yet. The more you move towards SaaS products, the less you're reliant on an on-premises Active Directory. And you can do things where you do full integrations with Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is the identity and access management control plane that sits behind the scenes for Office 365. If you use Office 365 for your mail, then you already have some level of Azure Active Directory. And so some organizations look at that and they say, you know what? I can unify my logins against this one control plane. Maybe I should expand that and remove some of that on-premises infrastructure. Or maybe you do a hybrid integration with an on-premises infrastructure in that Azure Active Directory. But either way, the ease of integrating a hosted solution into those types of features. Now, whether that's Azure AD or Google or Amazon's approaches to the same thing, the statement is still the same. It is much easier to integrate those components, to integrate your control plane and your access. From a reliability perspective, you can build for much less cost a very reliable environment in a hosted cloud solution. And that's one of those components where if you want the environment to have higher uptime, better failover, and high availability, that's a decision point for you. And that's actually one that we explore a little bit more later this week as well, talking about how you make those decisions around high availability and what kind of uptime do you need to look for, those types of things. Please know, no matter where you put your data, servers can fail, environments can go down, Azure goes down, G Suite goes down, O365 goes down, Amazon goes down. They all have issues occasionally. And it's just a matter of where you want to put the data and what kind of requirements you have to put around that. Last component on a public cloud is the ease for data localization, compliance, and regulatory requirements. It makes it really easy. If you have a actually fairly large at this point subset of compliance or regulatory needs, a lot of the components in a hosted environment are already certified in different areas in different ways, and you can sidestep a lot of those requirements and a lot of the labor that would go onto that. So knowing if you have any compliance or regulatory needs is an important thing. If you don't, congratulations, it's not something you have to worry about. But many organizations, even outside of compliance, have requirements around data localization. Very few of my customers have no requirements from a compliance perspective. Most of them at bare minimum have PCI. So there are components to think about. Where are you doing business? Who are you doing business with? Do you have GDPR requirements? What requirements do you have? What does that then mean from a disclosure and documentation perspective? Businesses today have way more technical decision points and discovery points than they ever used to. And it's going to continue to amplify over time. So the question becomes, how many of these decision points do you want to spend your time and your day investing in, rather than investing in progressing your organization? And that's really the stance on the public cloud. When we shift away from public cloud conversation points, the next is private cloud. Now this is a fascinating one. The idea behind private cloud is to take the benefits of a public cloud and isolate it, make it more private, make it so that you have more control over it. There are a few different stances publicly on what it means to be defined as a private cloud versus a public cloud. Generally speaking, what's accepted here is that it is a cloud environment, so it's still distributed, it's still hosted in different places. You still don't have to control or manage or care about the infrastructure that's underneath the control plane you're given. But in a private cloud scenario, you might have isolated environments. You might, in a private cloud, as an example, have dedicated sets of servers that are dedicated to your organization. Private cloud is something that can be a reasonably costed solution for you, depending on your scale. If you only need 3 servers, you're probably not going to want to spend the money on a private cloud. If you have even as low as 5 to 7 servers, it can start to become a reasonable option. And then once you start to get into the many dozens of servers, private cloud can become an option and can fall out of favor again, depending on your scale once again. So let's talk about some details around it. You're going to want private cloud if you want full control of the environment. You want to have extra flexibility. Flexibility in this case, as I'm referring to it, is going to be your ability to make customized adjustments specific to your organization's need. If you want to improve that security by not sharing resources. Now, this is an interesting one because frankly, that idea of sharing resources on a subsystem, the threat vector for that particular design is quite small, but it does exist. And an organization that is highly security aware or sensitive to different secure objectives is going to need to consider that. Your scalability from a private cloud perspective is typically on par with a public cloud, but may not be exactly the same. And then your options for customized deliverables, when you go into smaller providers that provide an option for private cloud versus a larger provider that does an option for private cloud, you can actually many times gain the benefits of infrastructure as a service, as well as the benefits of something like a colo. An example of that might be something that you would get from what I would refer to as a boutique provider, such as Tigunia, where you could do something where you could say, hey, I want to have infrastructure as a service for all of my server resources, but I need this physical piece of hardware in the data center for whatever the reason might be. Maybe it's your physical firewall. Maybe it's a VPN termination device that you use for some proprietary connectivity for a multi-site environment. There are plenty of reasons why someone might want a physical piece of hardware to terminate a specific connection type while still not wanting to maintain the infrastructure behind the scenes for all of their VMs. VM being virtual machine, for anyone that's questioning it. So a boutique provider is to say a provider that's able to give you custom specific deliverables. Someone that maybe is smaller and small enough to care about your unique organization's needs, not quite so large that they just say, take one of these 7 options or 700 options. Boutique providers are interesting. There's many of them across the country. You can get a lot of interesting customized workloads. Typically, boutique providers have a better cost point from the big guys like Microsoft and Google, and G Suite, Amazon, those different options. Boutique providers can also typically do more custom integration points. And that's going to be a fun one to dive into. So walking through each of these options, I want to make sure I recap the questions for you, the order of these, so you can have an idea of how to review and what that looks like. Going through the original components, you had your cloud applications in a SaaS deployment. You can do your own hardware, you can do colo, you can do hosted somewhere. Each of these bring you to the ability to say, what are my needs? What's unique for my business? And then how do I get there? Hopefully I've given you a lot of information here. We've got about 14 minutes left. And so for the remainder of my time here, I'm gonna bring Kelly back in and he's gonna try and walk through and we're gonna see if we can't answer any questions that you guys have been asking and help make sure that you're equipped to answer the question of what hosting option is gonna be right for you.
Thank you, James. I will say it was a great presentation. We really appreciate you showing us all the different hosting options for Business Central. And as you said, we do have a couple of questions here, so we can dive right into it. And as you guys can all see on the screen, that is our contact information here for Tigunia. So if you do like what you hear today and want to reach out to us, please reach out to us directly, either at info@tigunia.com or connect@tigunia.com. Either way works for us. So to dive right into the questions, the first question that we had was, out of all the options gone over today, what is the recommended best hosting option?
That is a fascinating question. I would say that the best hosting option is unique to your organization. It is a misnomer to think that there's a single option that's right for everyone. There's a phrase we use here at Tigunia. There's no such thing as one size fits all IT. If someone tells you everyone in the world, every business can use this exact same solution, then they're not considering every option.
Great
so,
answer. Thank you, sir.
I will expound one more thing, Kelly, on that. From a hosting perspective, there are options I consider better than others in most cases. I mentioned subtly at one point during the presentation, on-premises deployments on your own hardware in your office realistically only make sense If your organization is very small, is not sensitive to downtime, does not have any concerns about any of the other considerations I mentioned in today's presentation, and you just need it to operate, and if it goes down for a day, you're going to be fine. And if you just want to make sure you have good backup. In those scenarios, having a single server that you have a good, very good tested backup on can be viable. But outside of that use case, when you really don't have performance needs, when you really don't have customizations, you really don't have any of those other uptime, availability, or restorability needs, doing an infrastructure as a service or software as a service tend to be the better options. So something where you're hosted with a boutique provider, something where you're hosted with Microsoft via their SaaS product would be the directions that I would tend to lean people towards.
It sounds like a great segue into another one of our questions that we had. Seems very related. Said, if I am in a Microsoft shop / office with Azure cloud or private hosted cloud, which one would be the best recommended?
That's a fantastic question. So if you are mostly Microsoft, if all of your data is with Microsoft, you use Microsoft's products, maybe use Dynamics for CRM, and that maybe that's already hosted. The integration points for your custom deliverables can be existing in both places. I feel that there is a use case for Tigunia hosting, and it's the reason we invested in it and built it. Tigunia hosting exists to provide you a better performance deliverable than you'll get out of the box on Azure for a lower price point. You can accomplish almost anything inside of any of the big guys, but the cost to get there can be pretty high. In addition to that, from an integration and control perspective, integrating to any boutique provider through, say, for example, Azure Active Directory, if you're a Microsoft shop, is still also a very viable option. And you can even do things, you can do single sign-on across all of your applications. All of these things become possible. If you're looking to really answer that question, I would encourage you to schedule some time with one of the Tigunia resources here, myself or somebody else, whoever's appropriate, and we'd be happy to answer more questions and dig into that for you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and put that Connect at Tigunia email address in the chat again for anyone listening that would like to reach out to us directly. We do have one more question. We have about 8 minutes left. 7 to 8 minutes. So we'll do this one last question. And if you have any frequently asked questions that you would like to touch on, James, before we leave here today, that would be great. So for our last question, is what would you do or recommend in preparation for Azure going down?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So in prep for an Azure outage, you have to ask and understand first, what type of outage is that going to be in order to then create a response plan. So my recommendation to prepare for an Azure outage would actually be the same recommendation that I'll be making in one of my future presentations here this week around how you do business continuity planning for your whole organization. In short, you have an option to plan for a localized Azure outage. So let's just say a particular data center of theirs goes down, and you might have their product Azure Site Recovery, so you can have everything fail over to a different site that didn't go down. But if they have a global outage, such as the DNS outage they had late last year, that took out all of their Azure sites within whole regions, then Azure is going to be down as a whole. And so that's where you might have a plan to fail over to your disaster recovery site, and that might be through a completely separate provider. That might be through a different boutique provider, such as Tigunia. That DR location, disaster recovery location, might be set up in one of the competitors like AWS. You might have an integration or control plane in that direction. So there's a lot of options. And the real question comes down to which options do you want to protect your organization from, and how much do you want to invest into that protection? There's an important starting point when you start walking down both of those questions to actually understand what your uptime and recoverability objectives are. Because if Azure only goes down for 5 minutes, does that matter to you? What if they go down for 5 hours? Does that matter to you? Very likely at some point there it would. Is there any other questions then there, Kelly?
There wasn't any other questions. If you had any other frequently asked questions that you would like to review as we end the session.
Yeah, so I'll say that one of the other components that is often a confusion point is when people talk about the options around cloud computing, and there can be some very heavy confusion between infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. I have a slide that I touched on very briefly earlier today that kind of shows some of those responsibilities. And that's a point where you have the ability to have your infrastructure have more or less control. And the more control you give up, oftentimes the less you have to worry about, but you're also giving up control of those areas. So figuring out where you want to demarc that responsibility can become very important. And as you're working with any hosted provider, being able to talk with them and articulate what you're looking for responsibility as well as control and access is important. If you need to be able to install your own software on that server and be able to do your own actions and take those actions, most organizations won't let you do that unless you're on an infrastructure as a service, not a software as a service, right? Because if you install something and it breaks, now they have to fix something that they don't know anything about because you installed it. Mm-hmm. So this becomes this important component of understanding where you're demarking those responsibilities and how many actions you can take. How involved do they allow you to be? This is a personal preference, but I frankly believe that every organization's technology is core and central to their business. The technology wouldn't exist if there wasn't an organizational need for that technology. And so being able to own that technology, to be able to have involvement and engagement with it, while being able to outsource the components that are not correct for you or right for you to work with, is important. This is where we have a bit of a motto around as much or as little as you need. Have that partner that can come with you on that journey while still giving you the freedom to take the journey yourself.
Absolutely. Well, great. That's fantastic. We are ending here, the end of our presentation. I wanted to thank everyone again for attending the presentation. We hope this information provided here was beneficial to you and your team. And if you would like to connect with our presenter or to learn more about all of Tigunia services, please reach out to us directly at connect@tigunia.com. Again, thank you so much. And you guys have a great rest of your day, and make sure to attend some of our other sessions. We're going to have a few this week.
Yeah, thank you everybody for attending. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak and present, and definitely reach out to myself or anybody else at Tigunia if you have any questions about any of the topics that are happening this week.
Absolutely. Thank you again. Everyone have a great day.